We've been talking to Christy Warren as she's processed through the traumas that she was seeing in her life as a firefighter and her journey through PTSD. And she's written a book, and the book is called Flashpoint. We're going to put links on the Flip Your Script website so you can get it. But I want to read you something that's on the back of the book because I think this is really powerful. Her path to healing requires her to ask for help and draw on her deepest resources to save one last life, her own. And that really, Christy, speaks to the seriousness. I think PTSD is one of those things that people kind of throw out. They kind of like, yeah, PTSD, and we, unless you lived it and it almost broke you. You talked about suicide. I mean, it's not something that should be thrown out there like, PTSD, right? And it's because of books like yours that people have the understanding and the information to not feel the shame because you are talking about it. And on top of all of that, and you mentioned it, being a woman in this field, is one more complexity because you talked about men, if something happens to them, we need to help them. But women, you say, well, she shouldn't have even been there. She wasn't equipped to do that. Talk a little bit about your reason for writing the book, because I suspect it would be easier to go through the therapy, get on the path to help, and then do the next thing. You didn't need to go back and process and put it all out there for the world to see. Why did you do it?
Well, when I was going through my stuff, I was just trying to find any kind of information on what was happening to me, and I couldn't find anything. And I really felt like I was one of the only people who was going through this. Like, why am I mean, such a wimp that I can't handle my job? And that's what I truly felt. And I couldn't find any books on it. And I found a book by Clint Marlarchuk, who was an NHL All-Star goalie, and he had his neck sliced by a skate, and he almost died. And they put him back on the ice 6 days later, or something like that. And he ended up getting PTSD from that really bad. And he also had a very difficult childhood. And I read about it, and I was like, oh my God, like here is this tough guy, this NHL hockey star who got PTSD. And it was like the first time that I didn't feel like I was alone or I was the only one. And it helped normalize it for me a little bit. It helped me like ask for more help. And I've always liked to write. And so I started just writing about some of the calls that were haunting me. And I just realized like I have a book here and I want to write this book so other people can read it and realize that they're not alone. I have a podcast too, and I have first responders on that tell their stories of having PTSD and recovering from it. And it's so interesting because like every single story is like exactly the same. The circumstances are different, the families are different, and the professions are different, but the actual like heart of the story is exactly the same. Like PTSD is such a real thing, and its signs and its symptoms are, it's like they're all the same. And I just wanted people to know that they're not alone and they can read this and know that they're not the only one going through it, and they can read my symptoms and about my nightmares and about drinking and all that kind of stuff and realize that, oh, I am not the only one that's going through this.
It's interesting you talked about childhood. Is how much of the processing that you were doing through the calls and the haunting things that then took you all the way back to also dealing with things from childhood?
Well, one thing I've learned about people who do this job, they say that we don't choose the job chooses us. The majority of us have had very difficult childhoods because who's better equipped to operate in chaos than people who grew up in chaos? And, like the percentage of male police officers that were molested as kids is staggering. It's the numbers are incredibly high. And we grew up in chaos. We're able to operate in chaos. We want to save people. We want to rescue people. we want to, we put other people first. We're always about making sure that other people don't go through what we went through. And it was something I had to deal with because it was part of, what drove me, to be really tough and to, work day after day and not say and never say no, and continue to work through injuries and see all the stuff that we saw and not get any sleep. And it makes us feel needed. It makes us feel good about ourselves because we grew up feeling pretty crappy about ourselves. So the job really kind of chooses us, and it's something that you've got to deal with to get through all your everything. You can't ignore it.
Interesting. I didn't know those stats. I didn't know that it was a commonality between a lot of people that go into that profession. It makes so much sense. But
Hmm.
also back to the we don't talk about stuff. People that really need to talk about stuff are people who've had tough childhoods. And the let's talk about our childhood probably isn't a conversation that's happening in firehouses across the country.
No, not at all. Yeah, we don't talk about that stuff, in the firehouse.
But you would say we should.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the more information that gets put out there, and the more people like can read like me too and see that they're not the only ones who had a really tough childhood, or not they're not the only ones that suffered physical or sexual abuse, and they don't have to like carry that shame with them, that that there's something wrong with them, that this is so prevalent, and so many of their brothers and sisters have gone through the same thing that they have. And so yeah, it definitely is something that needs to be talked about, or at least people made aware of it, for sure.
Since you put out your book and since you've gone through your healing process and the podcast, are you surprised at the number of people in your profession or related professions who have said, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea. I'm going through the same thing."
I'm not really surprised at the numbers, just because when I was going through my healing process, I met so many people through that retreat that I went to, that have gone through the same thing that I've gone through. I'm really thankful that I've done what I've done, so people will, people have come, I've got emails and messages and stuff from so many people saying that, I had no idea what was wrong with me, and now I do. And I guess part of me is surprised, or not surprised, but just kind of saddened that it's not something we talk about more, and departments don't talk about more, and that these people are suffering by themselves. And it's so, so needless, and I think one of the reasons why it's not talked about is, as much as it should, is the fire chiefs and police chiefs and all of our leaders were once firefighters, or just bottom line police officers themselves, and they've gone through all horrible stuff that everybody's gone through and seen everything, and they feel the same shame. And they become even higher leaders, and so they think they feel even more that they need to be tougher, and they need to be a strong leader, and nobody sees them cry, and nobody sees them, as we say, weak, but which is really vulnerable. And so and so they don't want to talk about it, so they're not going to go out and support that the department talks about it. And I think it's kind of the basis of the problem for not talking about it more.
And if you're looking, you're serving alongside all these other people, you think, well, they're seeing the same stuff I'm seeing. They seem to be fine when they're probably suffering in silence as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like we have about 125 uniformed firefighters at my department, and I was like, why am I the only one that's going through this? Or why am I the only one who can't handle her job, and blah, blah, blah. And, when I kind of came out and talked about it more, and I went back to my department and talked to all three shifts and shared my story. And boy, the phone calls and the texts that I'd get from people at work that were like, yeah, I'm suffering too. And, could we go have lunch or whatever? And so much of our department was, is suffering. And it just took one or two people to finally talk about it, to kind of break that ice. But they don't talk about it amongst themselves. Like, I know all these people who are suffering, but they don't know that each other's suffering. because they don't want to talk about it.
So if someone is listening and they're considering this career, or they're in this career, or they're the spouse of, or the partner of, or the child of someone, in a profession like yours, what should they be looking for? Like what kind of things should they be looking for? And again, as a, caveat, you're not a trained mental health professional. However, you've lived the real side of this. So
Right.
what kinds of things can they be doing or seeing or saying before it gets to be a, something they can't function because of, or they're considering suicide?
I think every first responder could use a therapist, every single one. And it's nothing about being weak. It's about kind of getting what's in your head out and normalizing it and making it okay and not feeling shame. The culture really needs to change in the departments where you need to be able to, talk, and when you feel like you made a mistake and not get judged. And, and the other big thing too, I think people need to come home and talk to their families. They need to talk to their spouses and in some way their kids, because that way they have like a real support team at home, and people, or I should say, and, their families could point out when they're getting, short tempered, or they're acting differently, or they're isolating, because sometimes we don't even know we're doing that. We just react to things, or we want to get away from everything, and we don't really even know it's happening in the beginning. So educate yourself. If I think in all academies they should talk about this and the signs and the symptoms, and just make it more normal. And so when people, if it does start hitting you, you know what it is, and you don't spend a year or two fighting against it, trying to just make it go away, and you actually deal with it and not get to the point where you want to end your life because you just can't take it anymore.